Welcome to Upstream. I'm Shane Morris. I'm here with Tim, and we're talking about this week's conversation that I had with Kelly Kapic. He's the author of You're Only Human, How Your Limits Reflect God's Design and Why That's Good News. And of course, this is part of a brief two-part podcast discussion series that we're having on limits and how that fits into God's created design, intention for humanity, and the moral debates of our time, and why we all need to come to embrace the goodness of His limited creation, and that includes us. So, Tim, welcome back.
Oh, thanks. Always fun to have these conversations. Kapic, is a Covenant College, and like going to Covenant Seminary. Where was the background for the last week's? Do you know her affiliation?
Yeah, so Ashley originally hails from the University of Edinburgh. She's not taught there. That's where her PhD is from. But she's a writer, speaker, and podcast host. She's not in the active, teaching world, but the content of the books was very similar. I'd say the approach was different. So a lot of the same themes emerged in the chapters about creation, about our prayer lives, about not asking forgiveness for our limitedness, about recognizing what we can and can't do. Even the identity of Christ, identity in Christ idea came up between both of them. So, at some point they probably went to the same seminar or shared notes or something like that. Ashley's approach is very much more, here is the frazzled, overworked mom of 3 or 4 or whatever, and she needs a good dose of the theology of limits, and that's what that book did. Kapic's book really did more of a lay-level academic. That sounds like a contradiction, but it's the content of an academic engagement with limits, the theology of limits. And if it wasn't a print book and it was like a web article, then it would be saturated with hyperlinks. And you can see all his notes everywhere because he's constantly referring to other writers and resources. But it just fleshes out a lot of what both writers are talking about.
Yeah, I was just interested because I think that people's background in all sorts of ways can really affect. I wonder what, like a Roman Catholic perspective. I know that there's that book, the Roman Catholic author that's been around the office a lot about importance of leisure. And it doesn't mean simply luxury.
Is it Pieper?
Yeah, I think so. Something
Joseph
like that.
Pieper. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I just wonder how much our different traditions, how much our experiences affect these things. In your conversation, Kapic was talking about, highly driven, this kind of thing. I'm wondering how this would be a different conversation if this were, I spent 20 years in the service industry, waiting tables, bartender, all sorts of stuff. And I wonder how different a conversation like this would be. Because in the academic world, it's drive. You got to write the next paper. You got to do the next book. You got to teach the next class again and again and again. And I wonder how much that would affect one's perspective on busyness and the workaholism and watching the clock and stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just wondering, like, if you think that the different, not just theological traditions, but kind of vocational traditions, how that might affect the way people viewed these things.
Well, the question of what made Westerners so industrious and so crazy about making money, not wasting time, being efficient, and turning a profit is an old one.
Max Weber stuff.
Max Weber, of course, who I've interacted with, and not in person, obviously, he's dead, but in writing back in my undergraduate days. And his claim, he was a German sociologist or economist, and he made this claim that the reason the work ethic that we call Protestant emerged in the West and created modern capitalism is because, Calvinism caused people to doubt their salvation or their election, rather, and they needed to have a sign about whether they're elect or not. And his theory was that the Calvinists decided, being industrious, working hard, and then succeeding in material terms is the sign of God's favor, and therefore election, and therefore salvation. And so that's what gave birth to capitalism, or that's his theory. I don't buy that. I think that the Calvinist doctrine of vocation had a lot more to do with it than that. And it also ignores the fact that the West has this very extensive tradition of merchant economic activity that is proto-capitalistic long before the Protestant Reformation. So it seems kind of ahistorical in that sense. But the idea that there could be a theological conviction behind our drive to efficiency is interesting. And it's a subset of a larger question of whether the West became industrious, capitalistic, prosperous, and industrialized because of a worldview belief, something that we've thought about the world. I think that's accurate. I would be cautious as we seek to decide whether that worldview assumption or belief is good or bad intrinsically. I would say it's probably just different. It looks like, from my broad view of history, and you can fill out the finer details of this, but my broad view is that Germanic, Northwestern European peoples are very industrious and very time sensitive. Whereas there are plenty of cultures, say the Spanish-speaking cultures, Latin America, where there's a cultural value that's placed on the contextual time that Capek talked about, where the being on time is not as valuable as recognizing the value of certain times and the value of certain people. And that changes the way you behave. And one of the side effects is it kind of makes the society less busy and concerned with being industrious. Now, my instinct is to say that the Latin approach to things is actually more fun and more human, right? Did you remember the Simpsons episode where, and it became a meme, so you don't even have to have seen the episode, but where they go, right? They die and go to heaven.
Oh yeah, Hispanic heaven, yes.
Yeah, Marge is in Protestant heaven, and she's with a bunch of like cardigan wearing golf players, and they're like, Marge, we're on the 8th hole today, and then we're going to go and have tea and crumpets, or I think it was like port or something. She's like, where's Homer? And he's like, oh, he's over in Catholic heaven, and they're over there with, and Jesus is in Catholic heaven, right? And they're over there doing they have a rumba line, and they are, what is it called? A conga line, rumba line? I don't know. I have no idea. And they're just partying, They are having a great time. They got this little sheet that they're throwing each other up on. And the implication was that there's a big difference between these cultures, right? Long way of saying that. And I think there is a difference. I'm just not sure if it's good and bad, or if it's on the level of different, like men and women, men and women have different approaches to things, but that doesn't mean one's good and one's bad. What are your thoughts? Because maybe I'm totally off track on that.
No, I mean, I think what you're getting at some things, and I think you're also getting some good hesitations there, that we can look at, the stereotype of the industrious Nordic nation and the laissez-faire attitude of Mediterranean cultures and stuff like that, and like, oh, there's something there. There's at least a commonality there. But you got to remember, where did the real business attitude in Western civilization come from? So much of the business, it's the Italian Renaissance. It's Italy. Very much, obviously, a Mediterranean culture. So it's not so simple as region. I think that the things like culture and region and climate even play a difference. I mean, you and I are both from the South, where it's really hot in the South, right? And if you move really fast in the South, you get real sweaty real quick, right? It's very unpleasant, and there's only so much you can do. And then you throw in the fact that in the South, it's largely an agrarian culture. Even today, it's largely an agrarian culture. And you can't rush crops. So the Southerners have a stereotype of being slow, and not just physically not moving very fast, but slow on the uptake, not very intelligent and stuff like that. Now, there's lots of complicated reasons going on there, but there is the issue that is a Protestant culture, largely, that is in a very warm climate, and so that affects the way the culture do. My point is that things like ideologies, your belief about the world, the idea that your Protestant view of vocation, the Calvinistic conception of culture, and these things like that, those have a role to play in understanding why we're clock watchers. Other things have to do with it, the climate, northern climate, southern climate. There's lots of factors going on. And I think that's a really important thing about your two guests this past 2 weeks, is because they're saying, let's pause a second. Okay, well, this is the way we've been doing things. Let's examine, is this the best way? Now, they're in one sense, they're pointing out the negatives, and they didn't. I think that if they had a chance to flesh it out, they'd probably say, okay, here's the positives, here's the downsides of the take it easy approach and things like that. And I think that's important anytime we're having an examination of a cultural issue, to understand there's a lot going on. That on the one hand, we want to avoid the idea that we are cogs, that we work for the clock, that's the only thing that has value in our lives. Work, and just work yourself to death. On the other hand, you might say that's the early 20th century, the man in the gray flannel suit thing. You're a cog, you just do your thing. And then you get the hippie idea of like, well, you just need to take your time, relax, smoke this, smoke that, whatever it is you're going to do. And that's the way to have a good life. Well, they both kind of have a point of failure, both have a point of goodness. And I think that approaching it with that understanding that lots of things are going on. I mean, I think that's the whole thing about worldview. I mean, you and I work for a worldview organization. Importance of worldview is most of the times we don't know that they're there. Or as John Stonestreet likes to say, the most important questions are the ones that nobody even bothers to ask. And I think that's the importance of conversations like this.
The more important dimension that I think emerges out of this and that survives a sort of careful scrutiny of cultural influences and assumptions and the ways we can go off in the other direction, as well as the too industrious, too clock watching, too preoccupied with time approach, is that creation itself has limits and creation itself is good. And one of the limits that we're kind of gesturing toward here as we talk about your cultural context and honoring that while recognizing its shortcomings and the fact that there are other cultures that are also good, is that you come from a place. That's one of your limits. You are not a deracinated, isolated, generic human unit. You are an American. It was Richard John Newhouse who said that when he meets God, he expects to meet him as an American. And I never understood that until, I guess, much more recently. But of course that's the case, because the king of the human race, Jesus Christ, will forever be the adopted son of a Nazarene carpenter and a young woman of Mary was also from Nazareth, right? That's her hometown. And so he always has a context, right? I think Jesus still has an accent. I think we'll get up into his presence and assuming we can understand the language he speaks, which I assume we will, there's a whole new can of worms, but assuming that we can discern his words in that way, I think he'll still have the Galilean twang, so to speak. The thing that the servant girl at Caiaphas's house recognized in Peter's voice, because that's where Jesus is from too. He's from the shores of the Sea of Galilee. We all have a context. We all have a place that we came from. And that's one of our limits. The temptation of the modern world seems to me, and this may be where the industriousness, that Protestant work ethic goes sour and becomes something really ugly, is that we try to be metropolitan, or rather cosmopolitan, I should say, rootless, universal beings. And the internet encourages that belief. And you even see the development of this sort of global class of media figures, political figures, people who view themselves as, I think it was Al Gore who coined the term citizen of the world, or maybe Barack Obama was the one who used that. And not to pick especially on those two, but the point is there really are people who see themselves as primarily citizens of the world. And that's not the right way to look at human beings, because you have a context, you have an origin, you have a belly button, as Kelly Kapic would say. And that was helpful for me.
That's an interesting parallel we could tease out at some point. Metropolitan versus cosmopolitan, because cosmopolitan city, a person of the world. Metropolitan, like mother city. You come from a mother. You come from a place. You're not. This isn't Brave New World where you're born in a lab. We are come from a particular place. And I mean that does get some interesting thoughts about Jesus. I mean, you and I I'm about 5'11". You're what, 6'1"?
6'2".
6'2", okay, yeah. Which means you'd be significantly taller than Jesus would have been, most likely.
In all likelihood, right.
Yeah, I mean, it's very unlikely there are a lot of 6'2" guys running around Galilee 2,000 years ago. It's possible.
I love the stories of when the Romans met the Germanic tribes. They were stunned by how tall these people are, because they're just constitutionally quite tall.
Yeah, yeah. And there is a beauty in that. And that's what I love, is some of the conversations that you and Kelly Kapic were having about the importance of identity in Christ. Some of it I was like, okay, I totally know what you mean, but some of it I almost wanted to push back, but only partly, because I don't think he was saying not what I think. I think he was emphasizing the other aspect of it, and that he was talking about the abuse of it, the weaponization of identity in Christ. And that's absolutely true. There can be a way in which we treat identity in Christ as completely suppressing anything else about us. I remember in seminary days, you take personality tests, and someone took one of the personality tests. They had it was like right down the line. It was like on a spectrum thing, and it wasn't a thinker, it wasn't a feeler, it wasn't a, whatever it is, all of those things, right? And then one guy was right down the line. He was a buddy of mine. And he asked the class, like, what do you think that means? And the guy said, well, that means you must be Jesus. Interesting thought, though, there, right? Because this person was saying that the perfect person has no personality. I mean, is that what he's saying? Is his perfect balance of thinking and feeling, as though there's something wrong with me being a more of a cerebral sort. Or this young woman I grew up with, we've been friends since like first grade, and whenever we would take those personality tests, all of them came out completely opposite, as though there's something wrong with her being the way she is. So I wholeheartedly agree with what he was saying, that we shouldn't let our identity in Christ suppress our uniqueness as individuals. At the same time, there is a place for saying, yeah, this is something. There's a sense in which today all cultural ideas are allowed to put forward as unique and good, except for the whiter the maler you are. And there's a problem in that. And I think that's an issue that's where we can tease that out of it. I think it's perfectly understandable if someone is an African-American Christian, an Asian-American Christian, or fill in the blank, for them to come to American evangelical culture and feel a little bit put out, a little bit cast out. I think that's a totally understandable situation. I don't mean it's logical that they'd be in there. It's understandable they would get that reaction, because what do? They look like me and you, and they dress like me and you, and all that kind of stuff. That's a real thing. That's a very real thing. At the same time, you go to any conference, academic conference, this may spill the beans as to more where I'm coming from as an academic kind of person. The emphasis is rarely on the beauties of Anglo-American culture. What we should be able to do is you and I should be able to rejoice in our waspiness and the fact that actually, if I remember correctly, you can dance. I cannot. It's like we should be able to rejoice in our stuffy white boyness. The fact that what do I want to do? If I go out to one of the breweries around here, I'm going to have an IPA. It's a pretty stereotypical white boy thing to do. And I should rejoice in that. And the people who come from other cultures, they should rejoice in the goodness of who God has made them to be. So I guess that while he is rightly saying we shouldn't abuse the identity in Christ in the sense of denying non-Anglo culture things, I think the reverse happens sometimes too. And we need to be happy where we are. God has placed you where you are, and you should enjoy the fact that you like to go dive for megalodon teeth and with crocodiles and whatnot. And I'm just like, nope, not going to happen. I put in my notes here, I think that it's really hard here when we talk about our uniqueness, our particularness. It's hard for us to see beyond our skin. I think it's hard, almost uniquely hard sometimes for extroverts to understand where an introvert is coming from.
Well, it may shock you, but I actually consider myself an introvert. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm a talkative introvert. Yeah. Yeah.
I fall into a bit of that category too. Depends on the moment. But I think that it can be very hard for extroverts to see where introverts are coming from, because I think that we all naturally see our own perspective as normative. That's what I look at the world and I think, why wouldn't someone want to go home and sit on the couch with a book and read that for a couple of hours? Why wouldn't you want to do that? Whereas I had this friend a few years ago, and it was when, what do you call them? Flash mobs started to be a thing.
Right.
It was just like, it was the thing to do. And she said, oh, I so wish I could be part of that. Whereas for me, I remember thinking, if I were sent to hell, I think that would be an appropriate punishment for me to perpetually have to do flash mobs. And I think that it's very hard for me to understand what someone sees in a flash mob. I think it's very hard for other people who are more emotive to understand why it is you don't necessarily want to share. It's not because you're afraid to, you just don't want to. And I think that plays out in all sorts of ways. Our uniqueness is our callings as people. I think this can be, if you have a passion for something enough that you want to build your career on, that means you think it's more important than your neighbor does, which means you see what they do as less important. And there inevitably becomes this tension. There comes this tension because I begin to see that what I do is valuable and what you do is less valuable. And it's because I've invested my heart in it. I've invested years of my life in it. It's hard for me to see that. And I think that's really hard because we're not rejoicing. And I think that's in some of your conversation about rejoicing into the blessings of others. We also need to work on rejoicing in the giftedness of others. Not just that they have been given good things, not that kind of giftedness, but the priorities that they have in their lives. There's someone who has a calling to to work on a particular good thing, someone who for administration, or as you rightly said, it's almost like they need a metaphor of a body and members. I think that is absolutely key in understanding this.
Was it was Kurt Vonnegut who wrote the Harrison Bergeron short story? Yeah, it's about a world where there's like a handicapper general and they're trying to make everyone equal. What that effectively means is taking anyone who's excellent at anything and handicapping them so they're no longer excellent at it. So ballerinas and acrobats have to wear like leg weights, and people who are really smart have to wear these headphones that play constant noise every time they start thinking. And, it handicaps them, makes them kind of stupid. And it's a commentary on how equality can evolve into sameness or uniformity, and how that becomes a false view of human dignity. We are a body. We are designed to each contribute our own unique treasure. And that individuality, that's the good side of individualism. We're able to see the power of that individuality. But that individuality, I think, is only a subset of the particularity that makes us human. And that particularity has corporate elements, collective elements, as well as individualistic elements. So, corporately, Tim, you and I are both Americans, even though there are quite a few things that we don't share in our biographical information. We are corporately particular in that way as Americans, just like Richard John Newhouse. There's a lot we don't share with him, including our, side of the Reformation. And yet we each have our own thing to contribute. And, that's obviously the Reformation is over issues that we think one side is wrong and the other side's right. And that's something that, Chuck Colson and Father Newhouse never disputed. But there's particularity that brings unique value from each person. And the danger that I think we run into, and we've been talking about with this cosmopolitan identity, is that it functions as a new identity, as a global identity. So just, how we always say that there's no such thing as a truly secular or truly neutral public square, that somebody's morality is going to be legislated. That's obviously true. So if you try to remove religion from the picture, well, you get secularism as a worldview faith commitment that legislates itself and enshrines itself in the government. Same thing is true of identity, I think. If you try to purge people of their individuality, their identity, and get rid of their, Galilean twangs, they're going to assume a new identity. They won't be blank. They'll assume a generic cosmopolitan identity. And that's part of what's happening in the world. Now, we could spend hours sort of digging into all that means and why that's a problem and how technology has contributed to it. But my focus immediately lands on the church and the sense that we have that everyone needs to be the same, and that the church itself functions as a kind of replacement identity. Here's one example that just comes to mind, and it's immediately controversial. The question of what's often called Christian nationalism. That's the big bugbear these days in the media, is Christian nationalism. If there's any Christian making any kind of political overtones at this point, they are a Christian nationalist. The denunciation of Christian nationalism from secular sources is often pretty stupid and misinformed. But the denunciation you see from religious circles, and I've been thinking of a particular writer whose denunciation I saw yesterday, it calls us to a cosmopolitan Christianity, a kind of Christianity that says the church actually is doing something different than restoring real humans who actually are citizens in a real nation, who elect real public officials. Like, if you're involved in politics, Christian, then you must be making some kind of idol out of it, or reneging or shirking your duty as a Christian to the church. And that move right there seems obvious to me, is introducing a false conflict between creation and redemption. It's saying these two things can't go together. But nowhere in Scripture does it say that you cannot and should not participate fully in the life of your nation or your community or your family or your career or whatever it is that makes you individual because you have become a Christian. Instead, it says what in Revelation? That people from every tribe, tongue, and nation are gathered at the foot of the throne worshiping. It doesn't say people who form a new nation that is homogenized and that has no reference to the nations from which people actually come. and their original context. We have to be very careful there because it sounds good to say, like, no, you're not an American, you're a Christian. That sounds good. But again, that's like saying, no, Jesus, you're not an Israelite, you're not a Jew, you're Jesus. And that there's no conflict between those two. We think there is, but there's not.
Well, I mean, it's almost like with my kid, I mean, I've got 4 kids and they get called weird because, well, they are. And
I have the same problem.
Yeah. But I think about someone who has no weird characteristics, who's not weird in any way. That's probably the most boring person you can think of, right? Yeah. So to be weird is to be distinctive and unique and characteristic, things like that. And it goes even more than that there are individuals. In Revelation, there's more than simply there are individuals from every nation. In Revelation 21, it talks about the kings of the earth bringing the treasures of their kingdoms into the city. There is something beautiful about that. And I think that when you talk about politics, here's the trick when it talks about complaining about partisan politics, about Christians being too partisan. Christian partisanship is good in the first person and is bad in the second or third person. So functionally, what it is everybody thinks that Christians getting too involved in politics is bad, politicizing their faith. Everybody says that's good. But when I am doing it, or we are doing it, my side is doing it, it's a good thing. Because we are applying biblical principles to the public square. But when you or they or he or whatever are doing it, then it's bad. So, for example, I saw a tweet from just yesterday, someone who is not the same person I'm guessing you're talking about. This is someone who's a bit of an ex-evangelical. And he's been a big critic of a lot of conservative political activity. And despite you and I being broadly conservative, we have lots of criticism for a lot of conservative political activity. But this guy's been more notorious for it, for his critique of it. But this didn't stop him from listing out all the political organizations, the left-wing political candidates that he was going to support. Now, I bet that both he and the person you're referring to would be aghast if a Christian leader, a conservative leader, came out and said, here's all the people I'm going to support because I believe. His statement was more than, I like these guys, I think this would be good for the country. This was because I believe that thus and such a party is a threat, and that our only hope is to go with this other party. Here's the list of the people I'm actively giving money to and supporting. I grew up in Middle Tennessee, and in Middle Tennessee, the GOP is pretty close to GOD, okay? It's a very conservative area. And I remember this one guy who's now a pastor, so hopefully he's changed his ways. His ideas, he said, not only did he think that it'd be hard to be Christian and not be a Republican, he said he had trouble understanding how someone could be a Republican and not be a Christian. Well, that's a horrific statement, and he should never have said that. Again, I really hope he's changed his ways on that. He really thought that to be one was to be the other in so many ways. It was inevitability, not becoming a Republican made you a Christian, but there's a connection there. Both of these things are bad. Both of these things are a flawed view of things. At the same time, we don't want what you're referring to there, this homogenized view, the spiritualization of the church. Because, okay, you and I are both Southern Presbyterians, and Southern Presbyterianism has a really bad history when it comes to the spiritualization of the church, the spiritual nature of the church. Because what did it mean? It meant that when our parents and grandparents were our age and whatnot, they sat there. At best, they sat there while segregation was going on. Or at worst, they actively supported it. In a generation or two before that, what were my great so-and-sos doing? They were either silent because of the spirituality of the church or active participants in supporting slavery. We do not want a homogenized, don't get involved Christianity. What we want is a Christianity that has moral fiber and a moral backbone. So that means is rooted in something that's important about this community. What do we are part of this community. It's like the I was watching something about the Lord of the Rings, and we can always go back to them, right? Talking to the Ents, you're part of this world. We can't be the Ents when it comes to politics because this is our world. It's not just we have a political responsibility. It's because we live in this world. I live in Colorado. You live in Florida. It's important for you to be involved where you are. And I think we miss it when we treat ourselves as mere citizens of the world or merely citizens of the kingdom that is to come.
So we recently did this staff study on Bavinck's shorter dogmatic or systematic work, which is called The Wonderful Works of God. And Jennifer Marshall Patterson gave us a wonderful summary early on, and she's written this summary down and kind of published it, of Bavinck's whole theological project. And his project has to do with that relationship between creation and redemption, that Jesus came to restore and perfect what God created. He did not come to replace or supersede what God created. And this is where for me, the theology of limits issue really cashes out, and why I wanted to talk about it here. Because in many ways, we live in a time when both the church and the culture are falling into a spiritualizing error in their own unique ways. So obviously the culture falls into this error in things like transgenderism, where it's like not just the cosmopolitan attitude we're talking about earlier, but you might call it a cosmopolitan attitude of souls, where you could be stuck in the wrong body. We could also call it Gnostic, that you, Tim, are a generic person unit, and you are so generic that you are abstracted from your body and from your sex. And that's something that could be true, and you can reinvent yourself. So that is an over spiritualizing of the human person, even from people who call themselves materialists. But something similar again goes on with the church. And I think we see it in especially areas like the relationship of the family to the church, or the relationship of your calling as a Christian to your status as married or single. There's an attitude that prevails from every level, from like youth pastors counseling kids all the way up to top Christian publishing houses, where there's some kind of adversarial issue between these two realities. That if you're following Jesus, there has to be something else is going to have to give. The idea that Jesus actually has come to redeem these things, and that it is good that you're created a certain way, or that it's good that you have this particular calling, that it's possible to be deeply in love with and fully devoted to your family, your wife, your husband, your kids, and fully devoted and deeply in love with Christ and a member of his church. There's not a conflict there. I feel like there are a lot of Christians who have trouble getting around that particular corner. And I understand the mentality, because we are, number one, as Calvin said, we're idol factories, right? Our hearts are idol factories. We are very prone to worship things other than God. He alone deserves our worship. And then, of course, Jesus has some stern words about those who would place their family or their nation or their worldly goods in the place of God, or in his place, in Christ's place. And he says, you got to be willing to hate those things in order to follow me. But I have a biblical theology prof right now his favorite thing is to go through the New Testament and pick on everyone's favorite verses that they just assume the meaning of, put them in context and go, guess what? It doesn't mean what you think it means. So, he did where two or more are gathered, and he's like, guess what? This is not about worship. It's about church discipline. It's about kicking people out of the congregation. And the same thing could be said, I think, for Jesus' warnings about what we might call the idolatry of the family, of placing the family ahead of him. The context of those statements is in a Jewish nation that's about to reject Christ in its balance. Most of the Jews are about to reject Christ, and those who don't reject him are about to have to pay a very dear price for following him. And in that context, you do have to make a choice. But I don't think that's generally true of families or nations or even worldly callings, temporal callings, as the reformers might call them. And that cashes out in so many ways we can't really talk about here. But I love that this theology of limits has completed that picture for me. Help me to see that what Bavinck is saying, and what all the theologians that these authors talk about are saying, is that God created us particular people, limited people with a context, with a biography, with belly buttons. He likes those things, and he intends to redeem those things. And he's so committed to redeem them that you even get language in the prophets about my son Egypt and my son Babylon, bringing, I have to look back at the references, but bringing their unique contributions to Zion, streaming to Zion. I think Zechariah talks like this. He doesn't say they're not Egypt and Babylon anymore. He says they're my son, they're my people. They have become members of this one united thing. And I always go back to Lewis because he's awesome. He has this passage in the Screwtape Letters where Screwtape contrasts the vision of the demons with the vision of the enemy, God. And he says the vision of the demons is we want cattle who can someday serve us on our plates. We want them to be food, right? We're going to devour them, take them in. The enemy, God, he wants people to be united to him, but so that he can then give them a greater individuality, a greater particularity, a greater freedom. He separates Adam and Eve so that they can then come back together in a greater, more profound, voluntary, individual way. And I think the same thing is true of our particularity, our limits, the things that make us us. When he redeems Tim Paget and you're glorified and you are that thing that Lewis says we'll be tempted to worship if we saw it now, you're going to be, not only are you going to still be recognizably Tim Paget, you're going to be the Tim Pagetist dude imaginable because he's made you fully yourself. And same thing's true for me. That's a vision that's so beautiful and so exciting and reminds us that, God really likes us. He doesn't like generic human units. He likes the humans he made, and he intends to redeem them as those people. That's my big theological takeaway of this and why I thought the whole conversation was valuable.
One thing I was thinking of about the way we as Christians can, even in our personal relationships, over-spiritualize things. 20 years ago plus now, I had a friend, and he was good friends with this girl, and she wanted to date him, and he didn't want to date her. It happens, right? Well, he said that they had a conversation. They had the talk, right? And usually it was her who was saying she wanted to date, and he was not. Usually it's the other way around. But she said, we should date. We're so close. And he said, well, I'm sorry, I'm just not attracted to you. And her response was, well, we're Christians. That shouldn't matter. That's a really bad theological, anthropological statement, because it's as though it means that our humanity is irrelevant. Distinctiveness is of who we are. Now, that's a sad story, for her sake, at least. He did actually cave on that, and they sort of dated for a while, and it didn't last because why would it? But it just points to this expectation that as Christians, we should be indifferent, apathetic, indistinct. When you mentioned the transgender thing, I was thinking about The Matrix and how apparently, the Wachowski brothers, emphasis brothers, that they now look back at it as a transgender parable, which, whatever, there's a couple articles online about that. But if you think about it, there's at least a way in which it kind of makes a kind of sense, because what do? You drop into these bodies that they're going into, they spit in the Matrix. It isn't even real. Your real self is somewhere else, but you drop into this place, you drop into that place, and all of it's imaginary. You gain these abilities without work. You upload it to your head. There's this immateriality to so much of it. And I think it's the reason that becomes a problem is because we don't value those distinctives that make us who we are. We don't value who we are because our bodies, our jobs, our locations, they're just like clothes that we change. Whereas instead of there being me sitting here with my gray beard, that's part of who I am, and you doing your diving and whatever else there is, all our distinctives, these are important things of who we are. When I used to teach church history, sometimes I'd use American history too, because it works in both. I would, you're going to make fun of me for this. The river dance, okay? Yes, laugh. The river dance. I use either river dance or one of the spin-offs of that. But they had this one that actually I thought was really striking.
Do you have Irish background?
Yeah, significant. Yes.
Okay.
That bleeds in there. Yeah.
It's authentic. There you go.
Yeah, it is. I'm not posing. So in this dance, I think it was towards the end of one of their shows. I don't remember who came out first. It was either some Irish guys or some African American guys. I think it was African American guys come out first, and they're dancing to this music, and they're doing this tap music thing, and it's really cool, all this kind of stuff. And then the Irish guys come out, and they start doing their freaky arms don't move, legs spin around thing that they do, and it's really cool, it's really fascinating, and they kind of taunt each other back and forth. But by the end of it, they're both dancing to the same tune, yet each is doing his own thing. Each group is doing its own thing. And I think that somehow that's to me has always been a good image of the church. We have the same song, but we're approaching it in some of these very different ways. I don't have to stop being a stuffy white boy. Asian brothers and sisters around the world, they don't stop being Asian. They don't stop having the temperaments that they have, or as individuals, not just as Asians. All these cultures these are good and beautiful things. And sometimes we have to admit, it's hard for us to see, what the good in the other, because we're so used to seeing it only from our own perspective. But we need to remember the beauty that God has created all of those things. He doesn't want gray people. He doesn't want blah people. He wants the beauty and the distinctiveness. And there's something wonderful about seeing that. And I think that offers us to a good picture of what the church should be. We are united by the same song, but we're each dancing slightly differently according to who we are.
Beautiful. I couldn't have said it better myself. Well, Tim, next week we're moving into a new phase, and it's kind of the last phase of this general revelation discussion that we've been having on Upstream. And we're going to be focusing on one special and highly culturally contentious area of limitation, and that is gender, our embodiedness and our gendered bodies, and what that means for us. So I'll be talking with a couple of guests who will help me unpack that further. The important thing for me when it comes to placing this gender issue within a much bigger picture of the goodness of creation and what we learn about God and his intentions from creation is that, this is where things are under attack right now, but all of God's creation is good. All of it is worth redeeming. All of it is beautiful. And I think as we turn our gaze on ourselves and the area where selfhood and sexuality and gender are under assault, we're going to gain a lot from looking at it through this general revelation lens, from the perspective of God created this is good. The givenness here, these limits, are not something we should declare war against or resent or hate or pit against one another as if one is better than the other. There's a beautiful design here. And what men and women and those who are confused about which they are doing by saying, I don't want to be what I am. I want to be something else, something generic, something self-made, is what the Apostle Paul says the organs of the body are doing when they say, I don't want to be this, I want to be something else, or I don't need you because you are not a hand or you're not an eye. That particularity and that goodness in creation is something I really want to bring out in the gender discussion. And that's why I'm so thankful we were able to do all of the discussions that have led up to this point. So thank you, Tim. I really enjoyed this exchange, and I hope we can do it again next week just as richly and fruitfully.
Sure thing. Look forward to it.